Hey guys, my name is Cheyanne and I'm going to be doing my report on Robert Frost's The Death of the Hired Man. The first article I have is by Fritz Olschlager titled The Consecration of Home, Robert Frost, The Death of the Hired Man. The first point I have is that The Death of the Hired Man by Robert Frost is often compared with home burial because of the symbolism of home within both poems. The first point that the author makes in this article, home, which is centered around various aspects within each poem as would be discussed. We think of death as destroying homes and breaking up families, but as a quote from this particular article said, then the death of the hired man makes a counter-statement. Nothing can consecrate a home quite like death and burial either, which suggests that in the poem, Silas's death would actually bring the home together more rather than breaking it apart, as seen with Warren and Mary. The second point the author makes is that Silas's return to the house that he did work for, particularly the barn, because he feels some type of connection and symbol of home within it. Therefore, it is where he wants to rest because it is his version of home for himself. In the article, the author says, quote, Silas is sleeping by the barn suggests that he has returned not so much to his employers as to the place with which his own identity is most firmly associated, the center of work on the farm, and end quote. Further solidifying my belief that Silas wanted his final resting place being in the place where he believed was home. The third point the author makes is that Silas sees Harold as his son, figuratively, of course. He would be the closest thing he has. He shows this by showing him and teaching him different things while he worked with him in the barn. The author even mentions in the article, quote, he is left to approach the final bed, seeking the son he might have had, and hoping for something like the life-granting response of the earth to the phallic seeking of the skilled dowser. Most of all, however, Silas would like to have another chance to teach Harold Wilson, quote, how to build a load of hay, and end quote. Showing how much he still wanted to teach him, like how a father would feel about his son. The fourth point the author makes is that Mary is a symbol of fertility and resurrection, both because of her name and the role she plays in nurturing Silas when he comes home. This is seen when she drags him from the barn to the house, from a more manly place to a mother-like place, like something a mother would do. She then speaks to her husband about him as if he is their own child, and ends up taking care of him until he eventually dies. This quote from the article supports this. Quote, Mary's role as the poem's center of fertility is stressed both by her name and by one of the poem's narrative passages, which immediately precedes her telling Warren that Silas has come to die, and end quote. The fifth point the author makes talks about Warren's attitude towards the situation and his isolation or distance from Mary that eventually vanishes during Silas's last moments and eventual death. He goes from not caring that Silas is back or at first that he might be dying to becoming closer to his wife in the end. He shows this by becoming closed off from her when she goes to nurture Silas, but when he dies, Warren holds her hand as a sign of closeness and comfort. This quote also helps visualize the relationship at first. Quote, the narrative passage, together with Frost's depiction of Silas's final isolation, points up in the consequences for Warren holding himself apart from Mary, and end quote. The second article I have was written by Armand Boudreau, titled Come Round to Something Beyond Wisdom, reading The Death of the Hired Man through Frost's sermon at Rockdale Avenue Temple. The first point I have is that The Death of the Hired Man by Robert Frost comes up as a discussion in this article after Frost produces a sermon at Rockdale Avenue, which is a Jewish temple ran by his friend Victor Reichert. His sermon is based on the wisdom of man versus the wisdom of God, and how there is wisdom of wisdom, which is what God has and we should strive to have. The author then goes to talk about the different biblical parallels Death of the Hired Man has. He also goes as far as to make parallels between him, being Frost, and one of the main characters in the poem, Silas, quoting, typical themes discussed by critics over the years include the dramatization of feminine and masculine temperament, disputes between mercy and justice, and the connection between Silas, who wants to pass on the practical knowledge that he possesses, and Frost, the poet who wants to leave something behind, end quote. The second point the author makes is one of the parallels between the poem and the Bible. Quote, likewise, the major conflict of the poem, Silas's return after a long absence, and Mary's contention with Warren over whether to accept or reject the old man, recalls the parable of the prodigal son, reenacting Christ's story so that the father, not the son, needs salvation the most. End quote. He tells about how Warren was too agitated with Silas for leaving, then coming back after telling him that if he did leave, he could not come back, that he didn't even think to give some type of mercy to him, whereas Mary did, and he believes it is justice, the treatment he has bestowed upon him. The third point the author makes is that the relationships between the story and the first being Mary and Warren, and the second being Silas and on the other hired hand, Harold Wilson. In their focus on the struggle between mercy and justice, however, critics have largely overlooked a related conflict that occurs between the husband and wife, also between Silas, the old hired hand, and Harold, the college student whose interest in learning for his own sake so vexes Silas. Quote, there is a battle between mercy and justice between Mary and Warren, while also a battle of contemplative and practical wisdom between Silas and Harold. Mary and Warren battling between the two with what to do with Silas, and Silas and Harold battling when it comes to the knowledge that Harold has with learning Latin and such, just for fun, rather than learning something which could be of use to others and himself, like in a job. The fourth point the author makes is more about Frost than the poem, but does connect a parallel between Silas and Frost. Like Silas, Frost has practical wisdom. Silas shows this with his attitude towards Howard wanting to teach him something he can use rather than Harold learning something just for fun, because to him that is impractical and useless. In the author's words, quote, Frost sees human wisdom as merely practical wisdom that suffices to provide for men's daily needs, but also proves small and unacceptable before God, which shows how he also views God. The last point the author makes is the connection of the parable of the prodigal son in the Bible and Silas's return to Mary and Warren and the death of the hired man. Quote, Warren arrives home to find out from his wife that the old man Silas has come back, and instead of welcoming him with a feast as does the father in Christ's parable, he holds Silas accountable for leaving when he most needed help, end quote, showing how Warren should have been if he was not so keen on justice instead of mercy. He should have welcomed him back and helped to nurture him, but instead did the opposite and let Mary handle that. The only time he showed any feeling was after Silas died, when he consoled Mary in a way by holding her hand before breaking the news, showing an opening in his heart. The third article I have is by Bess Cooper Hopkins, titled A Study of the Death of the Hired Man. The first point I have is in the poem The Death of the Hired Man by Robert Frost. This author shows how Frost had the talent to portray it as though real people were talking to the reader. His words were able to convey such passion that it was as though someone was telling an outward look on someone else's life as seen in this quote from the article. Quote, the poem is an example, too, of his ability to take simple occurrence in everyday life, transform its actuality into a thing of beauty and universality, while creating the illusion that real people are now talking, end quote. The second point the author makes is how Frost was able to set the story right for readers. He set the scene in a farmhouse and barn, with Mary dressing in an apron and Warren being a farmer who was agitated that Silas decided to leave them during such a momentous time. The author described the setting as, quote, and on Saturday, for only on that day, does a self-respecting, hard-working farmer take time off to go to town for market things, end quote. This sums up the author's point of view of the overall setting of the poem. The third point the author makes is the way the poem is set up, saying, quote, the death of the hired man may be classified as a narrative poem, but it suggests a dramatic monologue, end quote. This points to the fact that instead of the reader visualizing as if they are the ones that are narrating the story, they are instead a part of the monologue within the story, making it even more interesting for the reader to engage with the book and the author alike. The fourth point the author makes is the relationship between Warren and Mary. Although he seems like he does not sometimes, Warren genuinely cares for Mary in his own way. He also does the same thing with Silas, pretending to be agitated with him while helping Mary nurture him before Silas finally dies. A quote from the article says, quote, "Mary and Warren have a good marriage," the reader feels. At the end of the poem, Warren slips to Mary's side, catching her hand, and waits before he says of Silas, "Dead," end quote. The fifth and last point the author makes is about Frost himself and how he slightly portrays himself in Silas when talking about Harold Wilson and his young college boy assurance. He reflects the poem how Silas felt about his opinionated attitude. It portrays Frost in this quote, "Some articles believe Frost is a moralist. He judges, but he does not condemn. He observes wisely and accepts on a purely exploratory and informal basis," end quote. Like Silas, he judges people, but even if he does not agree with him, he does not condemn them because that is not how he thinks. And because Silas has a fatherly love for Harold, it is only sensible to him that he does that because of him. Harold still has a lot to learn. Thank you for listening to this. I hope that it helped you in The Death of the Hired Man by Robert Frost.